um, we'll probably talk a little bit more about verbal behavior. And one of the other things that happened when I was a graduate student there was the first year I arrived, um, this young linguist from MIT came to give a talk in the psychology department at Harvard. And Skinner was in the audience. His name, you might guess, was Noam Chomsky. And
Mm-hmm.
the talk was on his transformational grammar. And Skinner was sitting there in the audience, and Chomsky never mentioned this paper that was already probably written at that time, that was to come out that following spring, which was his review in the journal Language of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. Um, and and there were some questions. Skinner asked Chomsky some questions, and things went back and forth. It was a kind of it was just the beginning of an interact. We had no idea then what was going to happen, but that review came out later, and most of the people who looked at it at the time thought, well, what does that have to do with Skinner's book? Because the review did not seem well targeting the book. I think we can summarize the differences between them, by the way, and with two different things, I'll say.
Yeah.
And remind me to come back, because I introduced Chomsky because I wanted to say something about the behavioral brain sciences thing.
Okay.
Two things were important here. One is that Chomsky was a linguist, and his main concerns were structure. He wanted to talk about what determined the grammaticality of sentences. Sentences were grammatical. They could be grammatical in different ways in different languages, but the concern was the grammar of the sentences, and it didn't matter what the person said, so long as they said it in the grammar of the particular language they were speaking at the time. Structure was the important thing. Skinner didn't care about structure. If you were at the table and you said, I'm thirsty, and someone passed you the water, or you said, please pass me the water, either way you got the water. The sentences were very different. But as far as Skinner was concerned, they were members of the same verbal class because they had the same consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Skinner was interested in function. Well, if you were a biologist and you're interested in structure, you'd call yourself an anatomist. If you're a biologist and you're interested in function, you'd call yourself a physiologist. And in biology, anatomy and physiology were two very different parts of the discipline, and those people went off and did their separate things. Nowadays, structure and function are now understood well enough that you can start to, if you want to talk about the function of DNA, you've got to know about its structure, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But over the year, in the early days of biology, there were debates about the priority of anatomy over physiology. Some people would say anatomy comes first, and so on, and the others, no, physiology comes first. Well, we are in a primitive stage of our discipline in which it has not been clear to us that some people can study structure and other people can study function, and they don't have much to say to each other. I think that you can look at what Chomsky did and look at what the things that cognitive psychologists did with those structures over time, and they were asking different kinds of questions. Skinner was especially interested in the many generations who've come after him who are interested in teaching verbal behavior, especially with kids who have problems, like kids on the autism spectrum. They had to learn to attend to the function. What consequences did this kind of behavior have? If you look at it that way, it's sort of sad to see a history in which you have these divisions in which people wouldn't even recognize or regard the other's work as legitimate. And Chomsky's review was critical work that essentially led to shutting down interest in verbal behavior over a very long period of time. Another dimension of this was that when this was happening, the Russians had put up their satellite called Sputnik. The United States was behind in the space race. It suddenly became important to translate Russian scientific literature into English, and Chomsky at MIT, with all the clout of its beginnings of work with computers, was making claims for computers that would translate to language translation. And they still basically do a good job if you mainly want to be a tourist and have it translate for you. Uh, but that meant there was lots and lots of money at stake. And my interpretation is that one reason to get the behaviorists out of the picture was didn't want them competing for the same grant funds and the same financial support and research support that you could get in an administration that was especially interested in language translation and these sorts of things. So I think these two dimensions of things, one in the nature of the subject matter and the other in the nature of what was at stake in terms of support, underlie all of those kinds of interactions. So, but getting back to the behavior and brain science, that the interaction between Skinner and Chomsky over the book Verbal Behavior was back in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But this book was done in the 1980s, okay, a long time afterwards, decades afterwards. It turns out that Stephen Harnett, who was the main editor, and he was responsible for who got who had the opportunity to write commentaries. We were talking about the book once we were beginning to wrap the project up. You remember there were 6 different sets of papers by Skinner that commentators were recruited for. And Stephen said, well, yes, I did send an invitation out to Chomsky for all 6 of these. And he didn't write a commentary about any one of them. And this is sort of off the record, but what Chomsky said, according to Stephen Harnett at the time, was, well, he said, when I wrote my review of verbal behavior and later when I wrote my review of Beyond Freedom and Dignity, I thought Skinner was dangerous. I don't think he's dangerous anymore. This Chomsky, reportedly Chomsky in the 1980s. A couple of decades later, I had an opportunity to accidentally to be involved in a correspondence with Chomsky. Actually, I could call him Noam because the correspondence was in the first name thing. I got an email from him, Dear Charlie, and he signed it Noam. And so it's nice to be able to name drop. but, uh, but But Stephen felt that we ought to get confirmation from Chomsky. And remember now, this is a couple of decades after that journal project was over. And he in that correspondence said, no, he never said that. And, it might be that he'd forgotten over time, but it was certainly vivid at the time we heard it. So that's a little bit of background of interactions and so forth.